Hello and welcome to Movers and Shakers. I'm Ken Miller. Today I'm joined by 40th District State Representative, and I guess technically I should call you State Representative Elect at this point.
Until the 9th.
Until the 9th, right? And this is December 27th that we're recording this. But welcome to Dave Buehler. He is the new 40th District State Representative Elect, won in November of this year. You were elected for the first time, and for those that may not know you, talk a little bit about your background and what made you decide to run for a State House seat.
Okay, so simply put, when I've been asked that question before, I've said I'm not through serving yet. And so what I mean by that is, and when I go back and look at my career, my working career with this community, my wife and I came here in 1984. At the time I went to work for Hallmark Cards, and Lisa went to work for Harley Russell and Russell Pharmacies. For the people who've been around here, Harley was here forever.
Right.
So we raised our family here, our kids here. Hallmark has always been a big part of my career. And then in 1994, I was commissioned in the United States Navy. So for most of my working career, I either served this community through involvement on Hallmark's United Way Committee. We had an employee contributions committee at Hallmark that enabled me to work for the community. But then also serve the country. Very proud of my Navy service. 28 years of both active duty and reserve service. Was recalled active duty twice. Served in Iraq and in Kuwait in 2014. And then in May I retired. And so it was, okay, what are you going to do after that? And it was really, I wasn't through serving, and my Navy career had ended, and so I had an opportunity to look at this. Wasn't always aspiring to be a politician, but again, I felt like, given the economic climate, given my background, and the fact that I have the skill set, I believe, to do this job and to do it well, I wasn't through serving. So that's kind of the Cliff Notes version of why. And then again, just looking back at my background, I retired as a captain in the Navy. I had 6 tours as a commanding officer. So I've got that military governmental experience. Probably the most relevant job that I had to serving in public office was I was with the Defense Logistics Agency for 4 years. So quasi-military civilian agency. Those things helped prepare me for this job. And then it was, if I had to add one other element to it. When we began considering this, and I did have thoughtful conversations with David French, the previous representative. It was, I know I can do the job, but what I didn't have was the team around me. And Dan Clemens, city councilman in Lansing, was an instrumental part of my team. Very helpful for me, very helpful as a mentor. Those people helped get me through the campaign part and to this point. So that's kind of the background.
Right.
So.
Well, and you, before we came on camera, you mentioned that you've already been to Topeka to the How to Be a Legislator class earlier in December. Talk a little bit about that, because I'm sure other people I've talked to who were first-time legislators told me that there's a lot of eye-opening stuff that you learn that maybe you didn't pick up on the campaign trail when you had to run.
I don't mean, and I'm not laughing at that, but it's an overwhelming thought of, okay, now I've got through the campaign, now I have to be a legislator. So there's a couple of things, and I would say this not facetiously or with a little bit of humor. I think it's been over 40 years ago. I actually went to Missouri Boys State, sponsored by the American Legion, which taught the governmental process. And as I was thinking about this last night, some of what you learned there is actually very relevant. It is the process. But beyond that, there's two things, and I'll get back to the 5th and 6th of December, which was the training that we had in Topeka. And again, I'll go back and use my military experience to a degree. Both times when I was recalled active duty and deployed, I was deployed as an individual augmentee. So when I went to Iraq, Baghdad, I was working for the Army. It was a joint position, and I knew nothing about the job. So really, in short order, you have to go over when your boots on the ground and get up to speed, learn the job, and do the job. And it was the same thing when I went to Kuwait in 2014, then working for the Defense Logistics Agency. So it's that mindset I think you have to have when you approach something like this. I don't know it all. I don't know the legislative process in and out. So But I know in previous situations I've been able to come up to speed with those two examples relatively quickly. The second part, you mentioned it, it was the 5th and 6th of December. And this is the handbook they gave us for the camera. This is the Kansas House of Representatives New Member Handbook. It is a crash course or a Cliff Notes version on those things that I will be responsible for. So I've read through this, I've highlighted the relevant areas, and there's two pieces. There's the Legislative Administrative Services, and then the Kansas Legislative Research Department, or KLRD.
Right.
Those two entities in Topeka have been helpful, very helpful to this point, to get me to where I know who to go to, and then also know what resources are available. And then there's probably a third element, and the third element is the relationships that you build, or that, they started on the campaign trail, whether it was with Dan Hawkins, who will be our speaker, Chris Croft, who is the majority leader, and then Blake Carpenter, who is the speaker pro tem. Getting to know the leadership within the party that will help kind of get off to a fast start. Those are the things that have been very helpful, and that's how you learn to become a legislator. I got a caveat.
Okay.
The other caveat is, and I found this in, we talked about David French a little bit. It's all about the committees that you're assigned to.
Oh, sure, yeah.
So committee assignments have been made, and again, I go back to my background professionally. So of the committee assignments that said, hey, here's the ones that I have an interest in. My 3 committee assignments for this coming session are the Federal and State Affairs Committee. The second one was Taxation. And then the third one was Health and Human Services. And what I found is, in doing some research on those 3 committees, where they either had bills or resolutions that died in committee last year or were sponsored, those 3 committees dovetail nicely to the issues that the voters in this district identified on the campaign trail. So taxation, business climate, inflation, those were the top things.
Sure.
So if that's a lengthy answer, I apologize.
No. Be as specific as you can be.
Okay.
Some of those committee assignments, last time I talked to David French, who had the seat before you, I think he may have served on some of those committees as well, and kind of gave a somewhat similar answer based on his experience and whatnot. So it's good to see that they take that into account when the assignments are given for different committees. Okay, it's still early on. Again, this is being recorded in late December. There are a few issues that have already kind of bubbled to the top, none of which are surprising at this point. But let's start in the 2023 session. I think you can expect, based on what happened in Missouri recently, that there's a good chance you're going to be facing at least medicinal marijuana legislation, something to legalize that in the state of Kansas. So talk a little bit about that. You sound like you've been doing research on the committee structures and a lot of things about how to do the job. Have you had a chance to dig into any of the issues yet?
Sure, and medicinal marijuana is one, and I would tell you that I've just scratched the surface on it. I think I'm going to put my glasses on here for a second. That was State Bill 158, medicinal marijuana. It died in committee last year. The bill itself is, if you go out to the Kansas Legislature's website, go to the committees tab, go down and hit SB 184, or pardon me, 158. That bill is 84 pages in length. And so it talks about, among other things, the conditions that medicinal marijuana could be used. So things like Alzheimer's, ALS, cancer. So all of those things where you think there's a medicinal benefit for people who are afflicted with those illnesses. So that's one thing, and I do think that's worth merit. Then the second thing is, how would medicinal marijuana be dispensed? Oversight comes from the Board of Healing Arts, the state's pharmacy division, and there's a lot of thought put into it.
Right.
So when I think about medicinal marijuana, I got to keep in the forefront. And when I've thought about this job or how I would approach it, when an issue would come up, I would say, okay, is it good for the citizens of the 40th? Is it good for the citizens of the state? And can I get my conscience around, is it the right thing to do? So those kind of three things run through my head. So number one, I need to get past all 84 of the pages that were there last year, because we do, to your point, would expect this to be an issue and resurrected in the coming session. The big thing for me, as it relates to marijuana, is I can get my head around medicinal marijuana. What I am struggling with is recreational marijuana, and I wouldn't want to see necessarily the approach used for medicinal marijuana to be a gateway for recreational marijuana,
which appears what's happened in Missouri.
Yes,
right.
Yes, and so in that case, I want to make sure that I'm very, very, very educated. States around us, whether it's Colorado, Oklahoma, now Missouri, others that have gone down the path of recreational marijuana in addition to medical marijuana, I think we have to really understand the potential risks and impact to society. Simply stated today, when I've had conversations on this with other people, marijuana today is not your grandpa's ditchweed of 1970 by any chance, in terms of potency, the effects on younger users. So again, my approach will be very pragmatic. I want to make sure that I understand all elements of medicinal marijuana, but I also want to make sure that is it just part of a one step, two step down to recreational marijuana. So I want to keep my focus initially on the medicinal part, and then kind of pump the brakes and see.
I would expect you're going to be hearing from a lot of people. You've already started to hear from people. In talking, obviously, Leavenworth Lansing is a very veteran-laden community, several communities. And from the veterans that I've talked to, some of whom work for the city of Lansing, their understanding is that there is a fairly organized effort among veterans groups that are in favor of medicinal marijuana to take care of whether it's PTSD or other things, other challenges that they face because they served. So, and I didn't want to get into that too much because you still need to see the legislation and how it would play out when there's amendments tossed on. And but your point is well taken about, and you're the second lawmaker who I've talked to. Informally, the first one, but they are very concerned about seeing it. How do we prevent it? Prevent it was his word. How do we prevent it from taking the same path as Missouri? Because if you do medicinal, it does not automatically mean that it has to go recreational after that. And that's something I think you guys are going to be facing. It sounds like you've already faced it, at least informally, in Topeka. Okay, I wanted to move on to another topic that I'm pretty sure you guys are going to face. And you may or may not have read the New York Times story that came out about how, all right, so that's, and I don't know how many people out there have seen that story. It's to me, it was a little upsetting, but not surprising, I guess, is the way I take it. So instead of really getting into that and naming names and things like that, I think that story is something that helps drive perhaps you guys taking another look, you guys being the legislature, taking a look at how does Kansas get a little bit more of that sports gambling revenue pie? Because it's from the numbers in that story and from other things that I've heard, when you compare us to New York or other states that have gone the sports gambling route before Kansas did, they're taking in a much bigger share of the revenue that's coming off of these folks that are gambling. So it's a long statement there, but is that something that you've already had a chance to delve into a little bit? Are you expecting legislation that would address that potential issue?
And I don't know how far down the legislative approach that will go, but again, that was a bill. Sports wagering came out of the Fed and State Committee last year. It was Senate Bill 158. Strike that. It was 84. That's the one for sports wagering. 158 was actually the medical marijuana.
Okay.
But that bill, SB 84, the summary notes that are out there available, I think, is 21 pages in length. And again, it goes back and talks about the architecture that was used and that the legislature ultimately passed last year, both through the House and the Senate, and the governor signed. Bottom line, is, and you referenced the New York Times article, the expectation was that the state would get approximately 10% of the revenues.
Right.
And I think the initial revenue estimates are abysmally low compared to that. And then the second part of it was there was supposed to be a mechanism to also provide funds for people who would be addicted by gambling.
Problem gambling.
Yeah, problem gambling. And I think what the state has found, and the article somewhat indicated, is we haven't received the share that we had anticipated. So either we were sold a bill of goods, or there's still more work to do. And I'm gonna go with the latter on that. I do expect there to be dialogue, kind of whether using military terms, whether you do an after-action review. Here's what we anticipated, and here's what we actually received. But I do think, as long as we're going to have sports wagering, if the expectation was 10%, we need to understand where we're at and why we're not. I don't know what specific legislative remedies could occur at this point, but it is certainly worthy of review.
And it would appear to me, when the initial legislation last year was passed, a portion of that money, if not a large portion of that money, the revenue going to the state off of sports gambling, was going to be put into a fund to help attract a professional sports. Right. Well, times change, efforts to potentially get a sports team here ebb and flow. I think that might be something that you guys are dealing with this year, is instead of channeling that into a fund for something that probably isn't going to happen in terms of whether it's the Chiefs or any kind of professional franchise, where then does that money in that account go?
Right.
You always hear education. I'm sure there are going to be a lot of special interests that have their hands out for that as well. Okay, budgetarily, and I've been doing this now for 15 years, and before that I've been in, it's very rare when I can say budgetarily you're not looking to grab every dollar you can because you're worried about keeping the constitutional right of the budget has to be zero-sum balance or greater. You can't have a deficit budget.
Right.
You guys have plenty of money in the bank, to use a phrase. Do you expect, and again, I know there's going to be legislation that happens between when we get done with this interview, well into March and probably April, but do you see potentially one of the things that you'll discuss with this additional revenue, that certain factions, certain lawmakers look at maybe boosting that rainy day fund? We have money now, it's going to come back full circle at some point in the future. Does that rainy day fund get boosted?
In my view, the opportunity to do that should be yes. And here's what I would say. Let's talk budget in general for a second, for the viewers who may not know kind of the cash position of the state, if you will. Kansas has exceeded its revenue, the revenue projections, in 27 of the last 28 months. Right. So work was done in 2022 to push the rainy day fund up to around $1 billion. So when you then take a look at what's the economic condition or forecast that we should be looking at, many would indicate that we're, if not already in a recession, that the country is heading that way. Or and maybe another way to describe that is certainly a continuation of the economic challenges that we have today. So if that's the case, I think prudence would say, let's make sure that we use those cash reserves wisely and put it into a rainy day fund so that we can weather future economic storms. The second part of that, when you think of the budget in general, is I think you have to ask the question, what is causing that economic condition where the state has taken in more revenue than anticipated for 27 of the last 28 months? And to me, that says you take a look at the overall tax rate or tax structures. And there may be, and there should be opportunities. That money belongs to the taxpayers of the state of Kansas. And wherever possible, we should return as much of that to them as possible. you mentioned the budget and the two biggies. Education accounts for, I think it's 60.2% of the state's general fund. Other entitlements are roughly 27%. It's what, $5.5 billion on education and 2.5 on entitlements. So of the money that's collected in this state, 87% goes to those two categories. So the legislator, in effect, is working with the remaining 13%. So I think we have to be judicious in terms of what we fund, what our tax rates are, and then I think we have to look at what we spend money on.
Right.
You know, I would go back to whether it's my business background or my work with the Navy and looking at what budgets we did there. The impact of regulations on businesses is one thing, taxes is another, but we need to look at those things in its entirety and making sure that we're delivering the best solution for the state.
Right.
So.
Right. Well, and it's already been said, and there was legislation crafted last year that eventually eliminates the sales tax on food.
Yep.
That seemed to be, while not completely bipartisan, it was close to a bipartisan effort. The governor is again mentioning let's just do it all in one fell swoop, which would revenue-wise, as you mentioned, give money back to the people. We all have to eat,
right.
We all have to shop for groceries and whatnot. Is that, and maybe I shouldn't even ask this question because it seems like it's a slam dunk, but are you seeing anything on the radar that says that might be more contentious than I'm assuming?
I think it's maybe a difference in approach, and maybe it's a difference in approach from what the governor has proposed, going to zero by April or July. I think the party leadership has said, okay, let's make sure that, I would say we're open to methods and approach, but let's make sure it's the best approach for the state. So what the governor has proposed is taking it to zero in April or July. By statute, what is proposed, the 6.5% food tax goes to 4% in January. It goes to 2% next year, and then
Right.
zero the following year.
Right.
So it's what is the best pragmatic approach, and certainly we will be challenged with either implementing the laws as originally anticipated, or maybe looking at some alternative solution under the overall header of taxation.
Right. Right.
So.
Okay. All right. Last question, and again, you've already been circulating in Topeka. You've been talking to people, obviously, based on what we've been talking about. Any other issues, maybe that you don't read about in the Topeka Capital Journal or the Kansas City Star that we haven't addressed yet that you're hearing a little bit about
Sure.
before you go there?
And I would say that there's several, but I would go back to the campaign trail a little bit. When we were knocking on doors last summer and into the fall, the things that I heard the most in this community and in this district, inflation, economy, taxes, property taxes, those things. So they're under that business climate and that economic climate. Education was a big one. So Parents' Bill of Rights, school choice, men participating in women's sports. Those things were big issues for the voters in this district. There was legislation that died in committee on all three of those last year. I would anticipate or maybe expect that in some form or fashion those come up this year. The week before Christmas, or maybe 2 weeks, had a meeting with downtown Leavenworth with the Leavenworth County Commission at the Council on Aging, and I heard this from the county commissioners, and then the very first introduction I had at the Lansing City Council back in June with Don Studnicka, the topic of the ad valorem or
Right.
LAVTR taxes came up. County Commission is very passionate about LAVTR.
Right.
Councilman Studnicka is as well here. I did hear a little discussion of that back in early December when we were there for orientation. How much traction or that has amongst the entire legislature, I don't know, but it is an issue, and it certainly is something that our county commission and our city commission has indicated, hey, this is a priority for us. And for, I guess, the people watching this, LAVTR is a transfer. The state collects revenue and then redistributes it to local or county.
It's supposed to redistribute it, right?
Yeah,
Okay.
hasn't happened since 2001. It was suspended after 9/11, and so it's a hanging issue that's out there. So
Right.
those are a couple examples of other things that might come up. And I'll channel David French here a little bit. What he suggested, and I'd already done this to a degree, is just going out to the legislature's website and looking at the 3 committees that I'm on, and just reviewing the bills or resolutions that are still out there from last year.
Mm-hmm.
Fed and State has 6 tabs. There's hundreds of bills that were out there. Health and Human Services is 3 tabs. There's probably 40 or 50 bills that were there, and taxation is kind of in between. So there's a lot of work.
And that's just carryover from
It is.
last session.
It is.
Right.
It is. I met a couple legislators in early December who were pre-filing bills. One was on education. I don't remember the details of it, but that is just an indicator of here's the work that is either kind of carryover, or here's things that are of interest to legislators as they begin their careers as well. So it's been we're certainly not starting with a blank slate by
Right.
any means.
Right.
Anyhow, I hope that answers the question.
Yeah, it does. It answers all the questions that we have at this point, and I hope to have you back, whether it's mid-session or at the end of the session later this year, and we can go over some of this stuff. And I know there's going to be things that come up
Sure.
that we're not even anticipating right now, and hopefully it's not because of bad economic news, but it's more along the lines of, hey, Kansas is doing fairly well financially. How do we spend that money to help the people
Yeah,
the most?
I would like to add this.
Okay.
And again, I'll go back to roughly the September timeframe. I was doing, our dining room became my campaign office, and I was doing research on just the state of Kansas and its economically where we stand relative to the states that are around here. And I think what dawned on me is the fact that you have to really consider what Oklahoma's doing. You have to consider what Missouri's, all of the adjacent, geographically adjacent states, their tax rates, things that they do to entice businesses, things that they do to keep retirees. We've lost, this state has never recovered from our pandemic job loss. We have an economic climate that isn't necessarily conducive to retirees to stay.
Right.
So those things, I think we all have to consider. We want to make Kansas a better place, the best place to be. It's been my home, continue to be so. And again, we can't look at it in a vacuum. What is in and only happening in Kansas? We have to look around us
Right.
and see what our neighboring states are doing to build the best environment for this state. For the betterment of everybody here. So we'll be doing that as well.
Okay, all right. I've been speaking with 40th District State Representative-elect Dave Buehler. For Movers and Shakers, I'm Ken Miller.